Have you ever spent a Sunday afternoon scrolling through Zillow, looking at houses you can't afford? You look at a small 3-bedroom home in a normal neighborhood, and the price tag makes your jaw drop. You do the math on the monthly payment, and it's more than your parents ever paid for a house twice that size. You think to yourself, who is buying these things? Who has this kind of money? For years, people have pointed fingers at Wall Street. Headlines scream about hedge funds and private equity firms buying up entire neighborhoods, and there's truth to that story. But it's more complicated than the clickbait would have you believe. As of Tuesday morning, January 21st, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that is making waves across the housing industry. The headlines are flashing. Trump bans Wall Street from buying homes. But here's the thing, and this is important. We need to separate the hype from the reality, because what actually happened is significant, but it's different from what a lot of news outlets are reporting. Today, we're going deep. We're going to look at exactly what is in this executive order. No exaggeration, just facts. We're going to explain how Wall Street actually became involved in housing and how big that involvement really is. We're going to look at the arguments for and against this move. And finally, we're going to answer the big question. Will this actually make a difference in your life? This is complex stuff, but I'm going to break it down in plain English. Let's get into it. Let's start with what President Trump actually signed. According to reports from Bloomberg, The Hill, and Reuters, on Tuesday, Trump issued an executive order targeting what he called large institutional investors in the single-family housing market. Now, let's be crystal clear about what this order does and doesn't do, because there's a lot of confusion out there. What the order does: first, it directs the Treasury Department to define what counts as a large institutional investor within 30 days. We're not talking about your neighbor who owns a couple rental properties. This is aimed at massive companies. Think hedge funds, private equity firms, and big asset managers. Second, it instructs federal agencies to issue guidance within 60 days to prevent federal programs from facilitating these large investors buying single-family homes. This is key. Federal programs, things like FHA loans, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the government backstops that make housing finance work. The order is essentially saying federal support is for families, not for billion-dollar funds. Third, it calls for antitrust reviews of large-scale acquisitions. If a company is trying to buy 1,000 homes in one city, the government will now scrutinize whether that gives them too much market power. What the order does not do, and this is where we need to pump the brakes on some of the hype, this order does not force companies to sell the homes they already own. You might have seen headlines or social media posts claiming that Wall Street will have to divest or empty the bag over the next decade. That's not in this order. The companies that own rental homes now get to keep them. Think of it this way: Trump is closing the door to new purchases through federal channels, but he's not forcing anyone to leave the house. There's also an interesting carve-out. The order includes exemptions for build-to-rent communities. These are new housing developments built specifically as rentals from day one. The administration apparently doesn't want to discourage new construction, which we desperately need, so this is targeted, not a blanket ban. It's a significant move, but it's not the housing revolution some people are portraying it as. Okay, let's talk numbers, because this is where the narrative and the reality diverge pretty dramatically. You've probably heard claims like Wall Street owns 30% of homes, or 1 in 3 houses is going to corporate landlords. I need to set the record straight because those numbers are wildly misleading. Here's what the actual data shows. Large institutional investors, and we're talking about companies that own 100 or more single-family homes, own about 3% to 3.8% of the entire single-family rental market in America. Not 30%, not even 10%, about 3%. Now you might be thinking, wait, I definitely read that investors are buying way more than that. And you're right, but here's the nuance. When you see headlines saying investors bought 27% to 33% of homes in recent quarters, they're counting all investors. That includes the dentist who owns 2 rental houses, the retired couple who kept their old house as a rental when they downsized, the guy who owns a duplex, your aunt who bought a condo to rent out. In fact, over 90% of investor-owned rental properties belong to small-scale landlords who own fewer than 5 properties. These are regular people trying to build wealth or save for retirement, not faceless Wall Street corporations. The actual institutional giants, companies like Invitation Homes or American Homes 4 Rent, buy less than 2% of all homes sold nationwide. But here's where it gets interesting. Even though the national numbers are small, these companies concentrate their buying in specific markets. In cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, and Phoenix, institutional investors own about 20-25% of the rental market in certain zip codes. That's significant. If you live in one of these markets, you're way more likely to encounter corporate landlords. So the reality is, Wall Street's footprint is real but concentrated. It's not everywhere, but where it exists, it matters. Why does this distinction matter for Trump's order? Because if institutional investors only account for 2 to 3% of purchases, banning them from buying more won't suddenly flood the market with affordable homes. The impact will be real in hot markets like Sunbelt cities, but minimal in others. This is why we need to be honest about what this policy can and cannot accomplish. To understand why Trump is doing this now, we need to rewind to 2008. This is where the story of Wall Street landlords really begins. You remember the Great Recession. The housing bubble popped. Millions of Americans lost their homes to foreclosure. About 4 million completed foreclosures between September 2008 and September 2012. Banks were drowning in empty houses they couldn't sell. Home prices crashed. In some markets, houses lost 50% of their value. But regular people, the people who might want to buy those cheap houses, didn't have any money. They'd lost their jobs, their savings, or their credit scores were destroyed. But Wall Street? Wall Street was sitting on piles of cash. In 2011 and 2012, private equity firms like Blackstone saw an opportunity. They could buy thousands of foreclosed homes at rock-bottom prices, fix them up, rent them out, and wait for the market to recover. Blackstone alone spent an estimated $10 billion buying foreclosed properties starting in 2011. And here's something most people don't know. The federal government actually encouraged this. In 2012, Fannie Mae launched something called the REO to Rental Pilot Program. REO stands for real estate owned, basically foreclosed homes that Fannie Mae was stuck holding. They sold about 2,500 of these homes directly to investors in bulk deals. At the time, policymakers thought this was a good idea. They figured at least someone is stabilizing these neighborhoods and putting renters in these empty houses instead of letting them rot. And in the short term, it worked. Neighborhoods stabilized, prices stopped falling, the companies fixed up the homes. But then something changed. The economy recovered. People wanted to buy houses again, but when they went shopping, they discovered that a chunk of the inventory was gone, converted into permanent rentals owned by corporations. These companies realized they'd stumbled onto a new business model. If you own thousands of homes and you rent them all out, you have predictable monthly cash flow. Wall Street loves predictable cash flow. They could package these rental revenues into securities and sell them to investors just like they used to do with mortgages. Fast forward to the pandemic in 2020, the housing market went absolutely crazy. Demand spiked, interest rates dropped to historic lows, everyone wanted to buy, but there weren't enough houses. And here's where the frustration came in. Regular buyers kept getting outbid by all-cash offers with no inspection contingencies, closing in days. Sometimes these were corporate buyers. Sometimes they were wealthy individuals. Sometimes they were foreign investors. But the perception took hold. Wall Street is stealing the American dream. The truth is more nuanced, but the anger is real. And that anger is what Trump is tapping into with this executive order. Let's talk about why millions of Americans are celebrating this executive order. And look, I'm going to be fair here. There are legitimate arguments on both sides, but the case for restricting Wall Street and housing resonates deeply with a lot of people. The core argument is simple. A first-time homebuyer saving up a down payment should not have to compete with a company managing billions of dollars. It's an uneven playing field. When a young couple offers $310,000 on a house and gets beaten by an all-cash offer of $350,000 from a corporation, it feels rigged. The couple needs to get a mortgage, arrange an inspection, and hope the appraisal comes in right. The corporation just wires the money. Supporters say that by keeping these mega buyers out of the market, or at least removing their federal advantages, you level the playing field. You give families a fighting chance. For most American families, their home is their wealth. It's how the middle class builds equity and passes something down to their kids. If you lock an entire generation out of homeownership, you ensure they'll be poorer than their parents. Renters don't build equity. Every month, their rent payment goes to someone else's wealth. If corporate ownership becomes the norm, we're creating a permanent renter class, essentially economic feudalism for the 21st century. When a family buys a home, they have skin in the game. They care about the schools, the parks, the neighborhood. They're invested literally and emotionally. When a corporation owns a home, it's just an asset on a spreadsheet. Tenants cycle through every year or two. The property might not be maintained as well. You're not calling a local landlord who lives down the street. You're calling a 1-800 number and navigating a corporate phone tree. Critics argue that corporate landlords are destroying the fabric of American neighborhoods. There's something lost when a street goes from owner-occupied to investor-owned. Here's where it gets economically interesting. When one company owns a large percentage of rentals in a specific market, say 20% of the rentals in a Phoenix suburb, they have pricing power. They can raise rents knowing that tenants don't have many other options. Some researchers have found evidence of algorithmic rent setting, where landlords use the same software to determine pricing, effectively coordinating rent increases without explicitly colluding. By breaking up this concentration, the hope is that rental prices become more competitive. Trump is framing this as a fight for the little guy against the elites. And honestly, it's working politically. The anger at corporate landlords crosses party lines. Progressives hate Wall Street. Conservatives value homeownership as part of the American dream. Trump found an issue where he can unite both sides. Now let's flip the coin. What are the counter-arguments? What could go wrong? And to be clear, I'm not carrying water for Wall Street here. But if we're going to be intellectually honest, we need to consider the unintended consequences. Wall Street is not going to take this lying down. They have the best lawyers money can buy, and they're going to sue. They'll argue this is government overreach, potentially unconstitutional interference with property rights and free markets. This means the executive order might get tied up in court for years. While the lawyers fight, nothing changes on the ground. The headlines say Trump bans Wall Street, but in practice, business continues as usual while judges deliberate. Here's something that surprised me when I dug into the research. Some studies have found that markets with higher institutional investor presence actually saw home prices decline more in recent years, not less. One analysis showed that markets with under 1% institutional ownership saw prices grow by 0.5%, while markets with 1 to 3% institutional ownership saw prices fall by 3.6%. Why would that be? One theory is that when institutional investors pull back, which they've been doing since interest rates rose, they stop competing for homes, which reduces demand and lowers prices. If that's true, then banning them might not have the effect people expect. Not everyone wants to buy a home. Students, people who move frequently for work, folks going through life transitions, they need rentals. And institutional landlords argue they provide a service, professionally managed, standardized rental homes in good neighborhoods. If you force institutional capital out of the rental market, who fills that gap? If there are fewer rental homes available, what happens to rent prices? Basic economics says they go up. So this policy might help aspiring homeowners while accidentally hurting people who need to rent. That's a trade-off we should acknowledge. Right now, some new housing is being built specifically as build-to-rent communities. Developers know they can sell an entire neighborhood to one corporate buyer, which makes financing easier. Trump's order has a carve-out for this, which is smart, but there's still uncertainty. If institutional investors are nervous about regulatory risk, they might pull back on funding new construction. We have a severe housing shortage in America. We need to build millions more homes. If this policy scares away capital that funds construction, we could end up with even fewer homes being built. That would make the shortage worse, not better. The order directs Treasury to define large institutional investor within 30 days. Where they draw that line matters enormously. Is it 100 homes, 1,000, $50 million in assets, $500 million? If the definition is too broad, you catch small-time landlords who are just trying to build a retirement nest egg. If it's too narrow, Wall Street firms will just restructure to stay under the threshold. They'll create 50 smaller LLCs instead of one big fund. The implementation will determine whether this policy succeeds or becomes a loophole-ridden mess. Let's zoom out for a second. This executive order is about more than housing policy. It's a signal about what kind of economy Americans want. For the last 40 years, we've been living through what economists call the financialization of everything. Houses became assets to trade. Student loans got bundled into securities. Private equity bought up everything from veterinary clinics to prison phone systems. The logic was markets are efficient, capital should flow freely, and profit maximization creates the best outcomes. But a growing number of Americans, left and right, are pushing back. They're saying, wait, some things shouldn't be purely about maximizing returns. Some things are too important. Housing is at the top of that list. Shelter is a basic human need. Homeownership has been central to the American identity for generations. Trump's executive order is part of a broader backlash against financial capitalism. You're seeing it in antitrust actions against big tech. You're seeing it in debates about private equity and healthcare. You're seeing it in concerns about foreign buyers and billionaires purchasing farmland. The question we're wrestling with as a country is, what's the right balance between free markets and protecting social stability? This isn't the first time America has had this debate. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the government created the FHA and mortgage interest deduction specifically to promote home ownership. They believed a nation of homeowners was more stable, more invested in their communities. Now we're asking, did we lose sight of that goal? Did we let market forces go too far? It's worth noting that America isn't alone in this struggle. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all dealing with housing affordability crises and foreign or corporate investment concerns. Some have imposed foreign buyer bans or taxes on vacant properties. We're all trying to figure out how to make housing work in a globalized, financialized economy. All right, enough theory. Let's talk about what this executive order means for your actual life. If you're trying to buy a home right now, don't expect prices to drop next week. Executive orders take time to implement. Federal agencies have 60 days to issue guidance, and then it has to work through the system. Legal challenges will slow things down further. But here's what might happen sooner. Investor sentiment could shift. Even before the rules are finalized, institutional investors might pull back just to avoid regulatory risk. That could mean slightly less competition in the next few months, particularly in Sunbelt markets where these investors concentrate. That said, the fundamental problem, we don't have enough houses, doesn't get solved by this order. If your local market is tight, it's still going to be competitive. If you're renting from a corporate landlord, the good news is they're not going to be forced to sell your house. You're not getting evicted because of this order. The uncertainty is that if institutional investors become more nervous about the regulatory environment, they might be less willing to invest in maintenance or improvements. Or conversely, they might decide to sell voluntarily, which could give you a chance to buy. If your landlord does decide to sell, you might have a first right of refusal, a chance to buy the place you're already living in. Keep your credit score up just in case. If you're a homeowner, you're probably wondering about your property value. Most economists think this order won't tank the market. The institutional investors we're talking about are only 2 to 3% of buyers nationally. Removing them won't flood the market. In fact, if this policy makes housing more accessible to families, that increased demand from regular buyers could keep prices stable. That said, if you're in a market with heavy institutional presence like Phoenix, Atlanta, or Charlotte, you might see your local market soften a bit as that segment pulls back. If you're a small-scale landlord, the order should not affect you if you own just a few properties. The definition of large institutional investor will be key, but it's almost certainly going to target companies with 100-plus homes or tens of millions in assets. Your local rental business should be fine. You might even benefit if corporate landlords pull back and reduce competition for rental properties. Let's game out the next few months and years. In the short term, over the next 30 to 60 days, Treasury will define large institutional investor. Federal agencies will issue guidance on federal programs. Institutional investors will likely pause or slow acquisitions out of caution, and legal challenges will begin to be filed. In the medium term, over 6 to 12 months, court battles will heat up. We'll see whether institutional buying actually drops in the data. Congress might get involved, either to support Trump's move or to block it. And state governments might pass their own complementary or contradictory laws. In the long term, over 2 to 5 years, the Supreme Court could ultimately decide the constitutional questions. We'll get real data on whether this policy affected prices and affordability. The housing market will adapt. Capital always finds a way. And we might see a shift to different investment structures that technically comply but achieve similar ends. The wild card is that Congress could pass actual legislation that goes further than the executive order, or they could defund enforcement. A lot depends on the 2026 midterm elections. Okay, I'm going to give you my honest analysis here based on all the research I've done. Will Trump's executive order fix the housing affordability crisis? No, not by itself. Here's why. The core problem with American housing is that we haven't built enough homes for 15 years. We're millions of units short of demand. Institutional investors are a factor, but they're not the factor, especially nationally, where they're only 2 to 3% of buyers. Banning them from using federal programs will have a modest effect in specific hot markets. It will help on the margins. It might cool competition a little, but it won't magically make homes affordable. The real solutions are less politically convenient. Zoning reform to allow more density, reducing construction costs and regulatory barriers, building more homes, millions more, reforming NIMBY laws that block new development, addressing lumber, labor, and land costs. Those are hard. They require cooperation between federal, state, and local governments. They upset existing homeowners who don't want change in their neighborhoods. So is this executive order meaningless? No, I wouldn't say that either. It's symbolically important. It signals that the government is paying attention to the anger over housing. It puts institutional investors on notice. It might produce modest benefits in concentrated markets. And sometimes political symbolism matters. Sometimes the government saying, "we're on your side," gives people hope and changes the psychology of the market. But if you're expecting this to be the silver bullet that solves housing affordability, you're going to be disappointed. If I'm being honest, here's what a comprehensive solution would look like. Build way more homes through incentives, reduced regulations, federal funding, reform zoning to allow more housing types in more places. Yes, restrict institutional advantages in the market, like this order attempts. Provide down payment assistance for first-time buyers. Increase supply across the board so everyone has more choices. It's a yes and situation, not an either or. Let me wrap this up with the most important takeaways. President Trump signed an executive order on January 21st, 2025, targeting large institutional investors in single-family housing. It directs federal agencies to stop facilitating their purchases through federal programs and calls for antitrust reviews. It does not force them to sell homes they already own, despite what you might have seen in breathless headlines. The impact will be real but limited. In Sunbelt cities with concentrated institutional ownership, you might see reduced competition. Nationally, the effect will be smaller because institutional buyers are only a small fraction of the market. The deeper story is about America's frustration with financialization and a housing market that feels broken. This executive order is a response to that anger, even if it's not a complete solution. If you're trying to buy, don't pin all your hopes on this. Keep saving, keep searching, look for creative solutions. The market is tough, but it's not impossible. If you're renting, keep an eye on your landlord's plans, but don't panic. The sky isn't falling. And if you're just trying to understand what's happening in our economy, why everything feels harder than it used to be, you're not crazy. The rules did change. The game is different than it was for previous generations, and we're still figuring out how to fix it. This is where you come in. I've given you the facts as best I can find them. Now I want your experience. Go to the comments and tell me. Are you trying to buy right now? What's your market like? Do you rent from a corporate landlord? How's that experience been? Do you think this executive order will make a difference? What would actually help you afford a home? I read every single comment, and your real-world stories matter more than any statistic. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening, not the hype, but the reality, hit that like button. Share this with someone who's confused about the housing market. And subscribe because this story is going to develop over the next few months, and I'll be covering every twist and turn. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive. Now you know the real story. See you in the next one.